For 100 years, the tank was the most feared weapon on the battlefield. Armies spent decades and billions building them, designing thicker armor, faster engines, more powerful guns. The most advanced tanks today cost between $6 and $10 million each. Some cost more, and a weapon that costs $500 to build is destroying them. Not occasionally, not in rare circumstances, systematically. The militaries that spent those billions knew this was coming. The vulnerability was documented. The evidence existed for decades before the first $500 missile took out a $10 million tank on a battlefield that anyone with a smartphone could watch in real time. They kept building the tanks anyway. Let's get into it. The tank was never just a weapon. It was a symbol that said, if you have enough of these, you win. Send them forward, they break through the line, the enemy collapses. That was the doctrine that won World War II. That was the doctrine that defined the Cold War. That was the doctrine that got poured into every military planning document on the planet for the better part of a century. The problem is, the doctrine was built for a world where destroying a tank required something almost as expensive and complex as the tank itself. Artillery, aircraft, anti-tank missiles that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and required specialized training to operate. The math worked. Expensive weapon destroys expensive weapon. The side with more tanks and more money wins. That math stopped working. And the moment it stopped working is more specific than most people realize. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow erosion of tank dominance over decades. It was a specific technology, a specific design, a specific decision made in the 1940s that quietly made everything the tank doctrine was built on obsolete, and that nobody in the procurement chain wanted to acknowledge because the money was already flowing. Stay with me, because the exact year this changed tells you everything about why nobody fixed it. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War, Egyptian forces equipped with Soviet-supplied Sagar anti-tank missiles, each costing a fraction of the Israeli tanks they targeted, destroyed hundreds of Israeli armor in the opening days of the conflict. The Israeli tank doctrine, built on the same century-old assumption that armor was dominant, collapsed against guided missiles operated by infantry. The lesson was clear. Cheap guided missiles can kill expensive tanks faster than expensive tanks can kill the people firing them. That lesson was studied, documented, published. Every major military in the world analyzed what happened in 1973, and then they kept building more tanks, because the lesson threatened the entire procurement structure that the defense industry was built on. Admitting that a $500 missile defeats a $10 million tank, it means admitting that decades of investment in armor technology was built on a foundation that a cheap guided weapon could shatter. Nobody in that procurement chain wanted to say that out loud. The companies building tanks employ tens of thousands of people. Canceling a tank program means killing jobs, killing contracts, killing the political relationships that keep defense budgets flowing. The generals who approve tank procurement retire into board positions at the companies that build them. The system isn't designed to admit when a weapon is obsolete. It's designed to keep the weapon in production. So they didn't. Here's why the $500 missile works, and why no amount of armor improvement fixes the problem. A modern tank is designed around one core vulnerability it cannot solve. It has to move to be useful, and the moment it moves, it generates heat, noise, vibration, radar signature, visual profile. Every one of those signatures is a targeting solution for a guided missile. The FGM-148 Javelin, the missile that became famous for destroying Russian armor in Ukraine, costs approximately $175,000 per unit. That's the expensive version. The RPG-7, a rocket-propelled grenade that has been in production since 1961, costs between $500 and $2,000, depending on the variant and the warhead. It has destroyed more armored vehicles than any other anti-tank weapon in history. Both weapons exploit the same fundamental vulnerability. A tank's armor is designed to stop kinetic penetrators, high-velocity rounds fired from other tank guns or artillery. That armor works against the threat it was designed for. The shaped charge warhead on a cheap missile doesn't work like a kinetic penetrator. It doesn't punch through armor by brute force. It creates a focused jet of superplastic metal traveling at 10 kilometers per second, faster than any armor plating can structurally respond to. The jet doesn't push through the armor, it flows through it, and the armor that stops a tank round does almost nothing against a shaped charge. The engineers knew this. The shaped charge principle has been understood since World War II. Every tank designer on the planet knows that the armor protecting the crew against kinetic rounds is functionally different from the protection needed against shaped charges. Designing a tank that stops both requires compromises that make the vehicle so heavy it can barely move, which eliminates the one advantage that makes tanks worth building in the first place. There is no engineering solution to this. The physics doesn't allow one. You can add reactive armor, panels that explode outward when hit, disrupting the shaped charge jet. It works partially against some warheads. The people designing the warheads know about reactive armor. They design around it. You can add active protection systems, radar that detects incoming missiles and fires a countermeasure to destroy them in flight. It works against some threats. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars per tank. It adds weight. It doesn't work against all threats simultaneously, and it costs more than the missile it's designed to stop. The defense industry will sell you each of these solutions. Each one costs more than the missile it partially defeats. So instead, the official position became, tanks are still dominant on the modern battlefield when used correctly, which is true, when used correctly, in the right terrain, with adequate air support, with infantry screening against anti-tank teams. That combination of requirements is almost never fully available, and in the gap between the ideal conditions and the actual battlefield, $500 missiles find $10 million tanks. Stay with me because what happened in Ukraine made this impossible to ignore and exposed something the defense industry had been burying for 50 years. When Russian armor began its advance in 2022, it ran into exactly the combination that the procurement document said was unlikely. Infantry equipped with cheap anti-tank weapons, drones costing a few $100s providing targeting, javelins and NLAWs supplied in quantities that would have been considered impossible a decade earlier. The result was documented in real time on social media. Russian tanks, T-72s, T-80s, T-90s, burning, not occasionally, in columns, abandoned by crews who understood what the procurement officials had refused to acknowledge. The most sophisticated tank Russia had ever deployed to combat was being destroyed by weapons that cost less than the fuel to drive it to the front. And here's the detail that should end the conversation about whether anyone knew this was coming. Russia had watched the same evidence everyone else had watched. 1973, Gulf War, Chechnya, every conflict where armor ran into guided missiles in the hands of determined infantry. They knew. They built more tanks anyway. Because the alternative, admitting that the core of their military doctrine was obsolete, was institutionally impossible. The cost of that decision isn't being paid by the generals who signed the procurement orders. It's being paid by the tank crews who drove into a battlefield where $500 missiles were waiting. You, the taxpayer in any country that still has a tank procurement program running. The citizen whose government is spending billions on armored vehicles that a weapon costing less than a used car can destroy. That spending continues because the defense contractors building tanks employ thousands of people. The generals who approved the programs retired into board positions at those same contractors. The political cost of canceling a tank program is higher than the political cost of pretending the vulnerability doesn't exist. So the official position stays the same. Tanks remain essential. When used correctly, they dominate the battlefield. The problem isn't the tank, it's the tactics, which is exactly what they said in 1973, and in every conflict since where armor ran into guided missiles and lost. The fix isn't a better tank. The math doesn't allow a better tank. You cannot armor a vehicle against shaped charges without making it too heavy to deploy. You cannot make it fast enough to avoid targeting without making it too light to survive. You cannot eliminate its heat and radar signature without eliminating the engine that makes it move. The vulnerability is structural. It's built into what a tank fundamentally is, and the missiles exploiting that vulnerability are getting cheaper every year. The Javelin costs $175,000. Its replacement is being designed for less. Drone-dropped munitions that achieve the same effect as a shaped charge warhead now cost under $1,000 to produce. Loitering munitions, drones that hunt armored vehicles autonomously, are entering production at prices that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. The gap between what a tank costs and what destroys it isn't narrowing, it's widening. What happens next depends on whether the militaries still buying $10 million tanks acknowledge the structural problem before the next conflict demonstrates it again, in front of cameras, on social media, in columns of burning armor that everyone can watch in real time. The vulnerability isn't new. The evidence isn't new. The decision to keep building the vulnerable weapon anyway, that's the part that never makes it into the official briefings. The $500 missile doesn't beat the tank because it's a better weapon. It beats the tank because the tank was never as invincible as the people selling it needed you to believe. That distinction matters. A better weapon implies the tank could be improved to match it. Buy better armor, install better countermeasures, update the doctrine. An invincibility myth means the entire premise was wrong from the start. And every billion spent on the premise was money spent maintaining a story, not building genuine protection. The shaped charge vulnerability has been known since the 1940s. The lesson of 1973 was documented and filed. Ukraine broadcast the consequences live to anyone with an internet connection. The procurement programs are still running, the contracts are still being signed, the tanks are still being built, and the $500 missiles are getting cheaper every year. The question nobody in any defense ministry will answer publicly is this: if the vulnerability has been known for 50 years and the evidence has been visible in every major conflict since 1973, what exactly has the money been buying? That answer exists. It's just not in the budget documents they publish.